Hello everyone, my name is VC, and Pokémon Legends Z-A is the last Pokémon game, chronologically, and possibly also in another sense. Let's talk about it. So, a lot of the things we know about this game seem to imply that it could be set during or after an apocalypse. And by a lot, I mean basically everything. Let's first talk about the title. Legends Z-A. It's sort of strange the title isn't just Legends Zygarde, considering that the last game was just Legends Arceus. I think that implies two things. One, whatever the A represents, it's important, and they don't want us to know what it is yet. Two, Zygarde is not the only thing the Z represents. Obviously, the Z does represent Zygarde, but Z-A also represents something else. Z-A is the ending into the beginning. Almost the ending of one thing and the beginning anew thereof, or the beginning of another thing. Keep that in the back of your mind. Now, the most obvious thing we can glean from this is that A is a Pokemon. You can look at the way that the logo appears. Zygarde is... the patterns of Zygarde are on the Z. The pattern of some unknown Pokemon is on the A. There's a couple theories for this. I'm going to talk about three. First, I think is the weakest, that A is Mega Rayquaza. Evidence: Mega Rayquaza is canonically the first Mega Evolution. The most significant change to its design from its base form is the addition of an A-shaped plate on its face. And, of course, the patterning on the A sort of looks like Mega Rayquaza's patterning. Now, I said I think this is the weakest theory, and that's because I think both symbolically and also just phonetically, Mega Rayquaza as A is not very strong. Obviously does not start with A, for one. And it also doesn't really symbolize the beginning of something. Yes, it's the first Mega Pokemon, but it's not the beginning of something exactly. So an alternative is that A is not necessarily the beginning of what Z is the ending thereof, but that A represents the opposite of Z. Z, Zygarde, is the Order Pokemon. A is the Chaos Pokemon. This theory, I think, is a lot stronger. I'll get back to it in a second, after I tell you the third theory, which is that the A is Arceus. And on paper, I think this sounds like by far the weakest theory. First of all, the patterning on the A does not even close to resemble Arceus. Secondly, we already had Legends Arceus. We don't need Legends Zygarde-Arceus. But I think you'll think about it differently when you realize that the Chaos Pokemon is Arceus. Arceus is not the thing that we see on screen in the end of Legends Arceus. Arceus is an unknowably vast, literal god, that we could not perceive in any sort of physical sensory way. What we see of Arceus is just a representation of itself. And because it is so unknowably vast and all-powerful, the patterning that we see could be a representation of just a different form of Arceus, a different way that Arceus is choosing to present itself. Also, there's really a strong reason to think that Arceus is the Chaos Pokemon. And that's, well, let's talk about physics for a minute. Entropy is the law that when you have an unbalanced energy state within a field, the energy will slowly balance out over time until it is the same across the whole field. If you put a hot cup of coffee in a cold room, then slowly the coffee will heat up the room and the room will cool down the coffee until they're the same temperature. It's a little bit more complicated than that in practice, and of course it applies to a lot more than just temperature, but fundamentally that's the basic idea. Zygarde represents order, and one of the ways you could interpret order is not necessarily a balance, as it seems to represent between Zygarde, or between Xerneas and Yveltal, but as entropy. Entropy, of course, is also how the universe will end. Eventually, the energy state of all things across the whole universe, given infinite time, will balance out perfectly. The energy state will be stable across the entire universe. Particles will be evenly distributed, all moving at even speeds. Perfect entropy. And then what? This is a big question. Nobody knows the answer, but there are a lot of theories. One theory that I particularly like states that because there are always random fluctuations in the energy level at any given point in a quantum field, given an infinite amount of time, a perfectly entropic universe would eventually collapse into what we know as the precursor to the Big Bang, an infinitely dense mass of matter and energy, where, due to just random variations, everything clumps up into one spot, and boom, the universe begins anew. The cyclical universe theory. It's pretty popular. I'm not going to pretend that this is, like, scientific fact, but personally, I think it's very strongly supported theory. And this random noise in the field, these random energy fluctuations, that is chaos. And that chaos is what creates the universe anew. The birth of the universe is tied to chaos in the cyclical universe theory. Entropy leads into chaos. It leads into the creation of the universe. Those two are one and the same. And it makes sense if we think about this, entropy as the end of the universe. Arceus represents chaos. Arceus is the random fluctuations that create the universe anew. And of course, AZ itself, representing the beginning and end, is something you can refer back to Loxton's old End of Pokemon theory for more info on. So let's talk about more concrete things we know about this game. If you didn't know, not revealed in the trailer for the game or in the live presentation, but on Twitter by the Nintendo of America Twitter account, the game takes place entirely within Lumio City. Now, I saw this post, and there were a lot of concerned replies. And I'm going to be honest, I felt a pit in my stomach when I read it at first. But I've gotten more comfortable with it, because I think there are absolutely ways that could be done well. That's not what this video is about, though. Let me know if you want to see me talk about how I imagine a game that's set entirely in one city could be done and could be made just as vast and interesting as something like Legends Arceus. But for now, we're going to stick to what's important for this theory. The implications of setting the whole game only in Lumios. Let me ask you this. How often do you catch Pokemon in a city? Not very often, I imagine, and when you do, it's almost always just a simple fishing encounter along the coastline or something to that effect. That's not going to be how we encounter every Pokemon in this game, and I am willing to bet on that. I mean, the Pokemon that we see in the trailer roaming about the city, and the phrasing of this place as a place for people and Pokemon alike, makes it seem that wild Pokemon are just going to be roaming about this urban metropolis. Really interesting. Another question you might ask about the implications of having a game set entirely in one city is, how are they going to make a whole game's worth of content? Now, we've seen how cities in Pokemon expand in the past, and weirdly, the answer doesn't usually seem to be they expand out. Think about Mauville. Mauville are a city that seem to have some sort of Doomsday Prepper elements to it. Because in the original games, Ruby and Sapphire, they made New Mauville, this giant underground tunnel, also power plant, that seems as though it might be there for some sort of apocalyptic scenario. Also, Mauville, in the remakes, has Sea Mauville, the giant city on the ocean that's abandoned, as well as converting the actual city itself into a giant indoor metropolis. Now, Hoenn and the Apocalypse go hand in hand when you consider the Delta episode, especially when you consider that involved with the Sea Mauville project was the Devon Company, who obviously knows about the coming apocalypse in those games, I'm going to leave that bag of worms mostly unopened. And instead just say that it's very likely that we will see expansions to the city in the form of the city having multiple levels or even going underground. Again, interesting, and could very strongly imply some sort of apocalyptic element. Now, let's talk about the legendaries. Legends Arceus featured Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, and I imagine that Legends Z-A will almost certainly feature Xerneas, Yveltal, and Zygarde. But if the game's all set in one city, how are all of those three in one city, and why? Why are they, for one, awake, and two, in the same place at the same time? Here's my idea. Lumiose City, as we see it, is the last bastion of life. Everything around it, a wasteland. That's why we can't leave the city. Because as much as everybody's asking, we can't leave the city, what does this mean for the game? Why can't we leave the city is a question that I haven't really seen asked. And the idea that outside of the city is an apocalyptic wasteland is a pretty strong answer. It also explains why you might need to be a certain level of trainer or a level of researcher to access various areas of the city, a way that the game could still have a progression system similar to Legends Arceus rather than allowing you to visit the whole place from the very beginning. That would add a structure to the game that otherwise we have no real indication of where it would come from. Arceus was obviously about making the first Pokedex. Z-A doesn't seem to be about anything in particular, but having these areas of the city that are more dangerous that you can go into as you get stronger makes sense and gives the game a progression system. So, this is the last bastion of life, Lumiose City. Wild Pokemon are there, humans are there, all three of the Aura Trio are there, essentially preserving the balance of life and death within this tiny bubble in a giant apocalyptic wasteland. Finally, let's talk about not 2025, but 2026. Because that is the 30th anniversary of Pokemon Red and Blue, and most likely Generation 10. If there was ever a time for them to shake things up wildly, if they were ever going to do some sort of reset, something like what Loxton predicted all the way back at the end of Generation 6, Generation 10 is not a bad time to do that. And it seems that with Legends Z-A being pushed back to 2024, though it could be simply a consequence of the upcoming unrevealed Nintendo Switch ancestor. Successor. It could also be a strategy to push Generation 10 to start on the 30th anniversary, making it a really huge event for the series. And, well, having the apocalypse, having the beginning and end of Pokemon depicted in this one final hurrah for the current series as we know it, could lead into that pretty perfectly. Now, that last point, I wouldn't put too much into it. Because at the end of the day, it's fun to speculate, but Pokemon is a media juggernaut that really relies on being predictable and repetitive in order to succeed. So I do think it's unlikely that this would lead into some sort of grand universal reset. But the simple idea that this game is set in the apocalypse, the end times of Pokemon, regardless of what comes afterwards, it seems to be very well supported by all of the evidence we have so far. Legends Z-A is probably the most excited I've ever been for a Pokemon game, as long as I've been following the series. I've felt frustrated with the direction that the series has been taking lately, and seeing them take a year off to put that much more work into this game is such a breath of fresh air. Top that all off with all of the really strong feelings I have about Zygarde in particular, which I'll talk about in another video. I think this game's going to be incredible. And my passion for Pokemon is really growing right now. So, the next 2 years, you can expect to see a lot more theories and videos about Pokemon. Up next, I'm going to be talking about Zygarde itself, because it was weirdly left out of this video, and it's one of my favorite Pokemon, for reasons you might not expect. So make sure to subscribe if you want to see me talk about Zygarde and other Pokemon theories going forward. If you're excited for Legends Z-A just as much as I am, I'm sure you'll enjoy what I have in store. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next video.